Welcome to Plead the Cause, brought to you by Heart of the Bride Ministries, where we plead the cause of vulnerable and orphan children around the world. I'm Brian Chrisman. I'm the executive director of Heart of the Bride. And today, the podcast is a little different. Usually, Tommy Morris is with me, our director of community engagement, and he hosts these. But Tommy is under the weather today, so I get to host this podcast. But it's not going to be a solo fare, so don't worry about that. I'm actually joined today by a very special guest. Karen Vandervoort, also known as TK, is one of our missionaries in Zambia. And so Karen is joining me, though today she's in Niceville, Florida. She's not in Zambia. She's only about 20 miles from us right now. So Karen, good to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Oh, listen, well, I appreciate it because I know you're one of the millions, probably the majority of Americans who really don't like, recording and being a part of,
This is true. Yes.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, one of the things I like least in this world is hearing myself back on a recording. So
yes, I'm not going to listen to this podcast ever, so don't worry about that.
Well, and for those of you listening or watching today too, this has been a bit of an adventure to record. We are pre-recording this because when you see or hear this, I will most likely be in Kenya, and so this week we have had major storms in Northwest Florida, including today. We tried to start this a few hours earlier. The power went out at my house. We waited. The power went out at TK's. And then finally, I just drove about 10 miles to Michael's house, our producer, and so that we can do this. So I'm essentially on remote today, about 10 miles from my house. So, but we're going to make this happen. So I appreciate you being flexible, TK, and ready to go.
No worries. I'm ready.
All right. So today, what we're going to talk about is the poverty mindset. And let me say this: if you want to know more about TK, more about the ministry that she works in, just a few weeks ago on a Monday night, we recorded or actually hosted one of our Heart of the Bride Monday Night Live events with TK. So you can go back and find that on our Facebook page, Heart of the Bride. It would also be on our YouTube channel. Just search for Heart of the Bride Ministries. And there's another one, so just make sure it's ours. You'll see me, you'll see TK, you'll see Tommy that normally hosts these things, and so find that, and then you can hear more about TK and hear a little bit of her story and what she does. But TK is one of our missionaries in Zambia. She works with kids off of the streets of Kitwe, and specifically right now works with our girls who have come off of the streets. And you get some of the backstory in that recording as well, if you go back and listen to that. But one of the things that we've talked about over the years is the poverty mindset, and it's one of the multi layers that we're working through and working with a child from the streets or a child from any of our ministries. All of the children we engage are from extreme poverty. I mean, very rarely would we find one not in extreme poverty. They all are. And so, amongst trauma and then all of the experiences that the kids that she works with come, with off the streets, there's also the poverty mindset that sets in. And so today we want to talk about that. And, I always want to make sure that we're looking at God's word as we do these things, and just remind you, in previous podcasts, we've talked about God's heart for the orphan, for the widow, for the afflicted, and for the poor. God has a heart for those who are struggling. I mean, we are all created in God's image, and he loves his creation, and he loves those who are struggling and really does have a heart for them. And so, Psalm 12:5 says, because the poor are plundered, because the needy groan, I will now arise, says the Lord. God is moved into action by those who are taken advantage of. Psalm 41:1 says, blessed is the one who considers the poor. In the day of trouble, the Lord delivers him. Then God says, hey, I'll look on favor with the one who works to help those who are impoverished and who are struggling, who are needy. And so, so this is our ministry is specifically to vulnerable and orphaned children around the world, but this is also a part of it. So I appreciate you being here today, TK. So we're going to dive right in. So when we talk about the poverty mindset or the poverty mentality, is that something you can define? Like, how do you, if someone said, what does that mean, TK, how would you define that?
I personally I define it as like a mindset, obviously, because it's mentality. So it's a way of thinking, maybe processing, seeing things that is developed, like not at the moment, but has been developed over generations of generations who have,
Mm,
just been immersed in lack or scarcity or poverty. So it's not just it's a time sensitive thing. And I think it's not just individuals, it's usually, I think it develops in communities and
mm,
families, which
yeah.
I think is really important to understand.
Yeah. Yeah, most of our kids, whether, in one of our schools or in Zambia off the streets, come from communities, or in Zambia, you call them compounds, that are, they're just surrounded by poverty. Everyone in there is in the same situation and developing those, I don't know if you would call them coping techniques, but ways to survival techniques, I guess, to
Mhm.
get by. Would you define some of what you see from the poverty mindset as survival techniques?
Yeah, it's definitely all about survival, but it's also, that kind of thing has developed a way of looking at things. So they have a different type of worldview than, let's say, a middle class person has. We don't want to go to the middle class person. We definitely want to cultivate a biblical mind, a worldview. But yeah, they're different. There's different ways of thinking about time. They think differently about education, entertainment, decision making, perseverance, anything, any topic. They just have a different perspective. And so, therefore, if you ever work with people with, that have been generationally poor, it's super hard
Mm,
because it's not about changing their environment or even giving them opportunities, because often when you do that and the mindset hasn't changed, then what you have is they can't be good stewards of what they've been
right,
given. And
right.
so it's a vicious cycle, and it really is a stronghold of lies, really, that they have come to believe as normal.
Mm,
So it's
yeah,
it's a process, and it's a really hard journey, and it's the same for us, right? It's
yeah,
we have our own mindsets, and if we want to be transformed into the image of Christ, listen, it takes the Holy Spirit, but it's a journey, and it takes time.
yeah. Well, I'm so glad you put it that way. That was the word that was on my mind a few minutes ago, and you brought it up. But worldview, the way they see the world, the way they see life, the way they see themselves, family, community, government, everything is all shaped by their experiences growing up and by those generational experiences passed down
Mhm.
from parent to kid, or grandparent to kid, or whoever they end up living with. Many of them live with other members of family or friends, or they're homeless. Many of the
Mhm.
kids you guys work with have been street kids for a while, but just affects everything that they see. So, what kind of conditions, and this may be, a simple answer, may be complex, but what kind of conditions really lead to that mindset, establishing itself in someone?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, if you that's all you see. All right, we as, like, even literate people, we can read and we can be exposed to different things, but a lot of times these people are also illiterate. So
Mm,
really, the way they are shaped are really by the way they see things. What's
mm,
around them, and you kind of alluded to this. There's no new ideas that come often into these kind of situations, and their thinking is not really challenged.
mm,
And then when it is challenged, then you have them kicking back to their major resource, which is relationships. So if you look at that, if you, like, okay, middle class, our value is achievement. Their value is relationship and people. That's their major resource. You can see that, those kind of ideas or dependence on that can just be detrimental. It actually causes them to fail even more, because let's say somebody says, hey, you can be anything you want to be, and then obviously the community right away is going to say, no, that will never happen. Okay, because that's just their mindset, and yeah, it just sets them up for failure. So what is their biggest asset actually becomes their stumbling block.
Wow. Wow. Well, and you know that even when you said that, it took me even in a little bit of a different direction for a second because, um, one thing that always it surprised me early on was in getting to know the ministry in Zambia, walking around Kitwe, walking around the streets, are the relationships those kids have with each other, right? You find kids that do have friendships, they do trust each other, they work for businesses and establish relationship. um Gosh, even our, we've shared the testimony of Godfrey before. I mean, he was a trusted person. I mean, they really, that is probably the one skill I guess they have. Is that kind of what you're saying? I mean, that's like the one, but they depend
Yeah,
on it too much. Yeah.
yeah, but you can see that, okay, what happens, like relationships are super important to God, okay, but when it becomes an all in all, then it
Yeah.
causes problems, because then relationships are not for relationships sake. It's basically, what can this relationship give me?
Right.
Because
Right.
this relationship, the whole family unit, whether it's a street family or whether it's a compound family, I mean, it's all about, what can I get from that relationship? How are they
Mm,
going to help me money wise, provision wise? And so how that translates into our residential setting is that there is a huge loyalty to relationship. And so what
mm,
happens is, they will cover for each other,
mm,
right, in sin areas, because they know that if I do it for this person, they will do it for me, that
right.
kind of relationship. And so again, the system of thinking is never really challenged, because they're just covering for each other to
Wow.
get something in the future.
Wow. And would you also say that's what leads to what we see so often is manipulation? Manipulation through relationships to gain what they need. I mean,
Yeah.
some of them have an incredible skill at
Yes.
manipulation.
Yes, and that's one of those side effects, again, for making the relationship the ultimate, and so therefore you never really know where you stand with them. Yeah, because it's that important to them.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Well, that already helps me understand even more of what I've observed. Just the way you shared that background. Thank you for sharing that. And the next thing I was going to ask was, how does it manifest in general? But I don't know. Is that any different than what you've already shared with us? I mean, that's kind of how you see it through the relationships and manipulation. Are there other ways that you see the poverty mindset affecting the way that they act, the way they interact?
Well, I think it's really important to know that victim mentality is a huge aspect, okay,
Mm,
of poverty mentality. And so that has a huge effect on how they progress forward. And so the way we see it then in even the residential setting would be, again, they're not very good stewards of what has been given to them, because they think about things differently. So let's say decision making. All right. Decision making for them is in survival mode. It's just for today. It's not for tomorrow. It's not for the future. And unless you can change that mindset, no matter what you do for them or what you give them or what opportunities are presented to them, that's how they are going to think about it. And so there's no progression there. Perseverance is a huge element of being successful, even as a Christian, right? And
mm,
but for them, perseverance is usually non-existence, because they think no matter how hard I try, it's never going to change. Like,
wow.
my world is what's controlling me. I am
Mm,
not able to do any kind of controlling in my circumstances. My circumstances always control me. And then the other way it shows up is that very seldom will they accept responsibility for their actions.
mm,
It is
mhm.
always someone else's fault, some kind of circumstance's fault, So Yeah, those are just three examples, but there's so many because you can take each element, education, time, and go through that and see how that's detrimental for them to come out of those lies.
Wow. And I wonder if many people listening to this are like me too, because now as we listen to this, there's sometimes where I go, oh my goodness, I see these things around me. Right. I see these things even in experiences I've had in the United States and trying to understand. I mean, poverty mentality is not limited to third world countries.
Mhm.
It's all around us. Um, so in the first point you were just saying there about them not forward thinking, right, not planning, and I've had that experience with you not being able to steward and think ahead. um you know we've even in the past years before I was here, engaged in some loans, short-term loans, helping kids start businesses, not in Zambia but in other places. And that was the biggest battle. I mean, helping them try to understand how to, now you've got this money, this is an investment, here's how you steward it, and you you know but it's just so hard for them not to just take that and do something right now
Mhm.
and meet the needs right and not plan ahead. That is one of the hardest things to break in that cycle, is how to think ahead with this. Don't just go spend it all now because you need this. Let's plan ahead. That's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it is. It's all about, and we struggle with it too in the sense of instant gratification, right? Because that's
Yeah.
basically what it is in some ways.
Well, listen, let me ask you this. So that forward lack of forward thinking too, does that also present a barrier to helping them understand actions have consequences? Like, so think ahead. If you do this, could have these consequences.
Yeah, because yeah, and also it ties back to problem solving. Okay,
Mm,
they can't do that,
yeah.
so because of the way of they think about things, and so yeah, it all ties in together, and that's why it's so complex. That's
Yeah.
why it's not easy to work with generational poverty, and because it's about a mindset that has to be changed in so many different layers.
Yeah, I've described it in times to people who have traveled with me to help teach and help, disciple or do different things. I just am always saying, listen, don't count on them to be able to think critically and answer the question that, like, when we're working through lesson plans. That's a great question, but
Mhm.
that involves some really complex, critical thinking, breaking down the answer. I'm always quick to say, I'm not telling you this person you're going to be working with is this kid is not intelligent. I'm just telling
Mhm.
you they've never learned to think that way. Like, you've got
Yes.
to ask the simple questions that actually lead them in the process
Mhm.
to discover something, so that not only are they learning the something, they're learning the process of thinking to get there. That
Right.
is
Yep.
sometimes incredibly tough. And I've had that with adults in
Mhm.
countries or in places where poverty is so besetting. Like, I've been there and just gone, wow, I've asked a question and gotten that blank stare, like, I don't know how to get there.
Yep.
Learning to teach and disciple in that is incredibly tough. So how do we, or how do you guys, how do you begin to work through that and combat that mindset? Or I shouldn't say combat, that's the word I wrote down, but but to help unravel that, in the context of discipleship, how do you approach that?
Yeah, first we have just conversations like this, right? We have to make them aware of, the different kinds of views that are around, different kind of worldviews, and steer them into a biblical worldview. But they have to just kind of see it for themselves and recognize their thinking patterns within themselves before we can even move forward. But then it's still like for all of us, it's a um, yeah, it needs to be put in practice. It has to be woven into their everyday life and decisions. And that's where usually it kind of breaks down. They may
Mhm.
understand some of it intellectually, but then to actually start changing things the way they think, that's a whole different process. But that's where you start.
Yeah. Well, and that's also why because what you're describing is not something we do in a year or two. Um,
Mhm.
so, when I when I describe this program, especially our ministry in Zambia, Abba's Heart, Zambia, we talk about the years that a kid may be in residence. I'm always trying to remind them, hey, this has developed over generations, right? This worldview, this mindset, and this kid may have only been on the street a few years, but this is something they've learned from birth, and this is not something that's going to unravel in a couple of years.
Mhm.
So let me ask it this question from this perspective. How does that affect, you know, when you're, our ultimate goal, obviously, on top of, well, we have so many goals, but we want our children in our programs to come to know the Lord, right, in salvation, and grow in discipleship to become mature believers. We
Mhm.
want to launch them out one day into the world to share and live the gospel amongst their own community and send out missionaries. But so how does it affect, though, like the early stages of sharing the gospel and discipling them? I mean, have you got to start unraveling
Oh
multiple layers
yeah.
first before they can even comprehend what it means?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so tricky, because what we think is very clear in one way. All right, let's say this comes up a lot. That's why I'm going to bring it up. It's like God is a forgiving God. Okay, just take that simple phrase. To us, it kind of means, all right, He's a forgiving God, but you know what? I am still responsible for my actions, and my actions have consequences. I think most of us,
Mm,
that kind of comes to us innately,
mm,
right? I mean, partly because of our culture, all right? But for them, the hardest struggle is when you say, I forgive you, or God has forgiven you, and then you still have consequences, maybe even discipline. They totally freak out because they don't understand that. Like,
wow.
you said you forgave me. Yes. But again, it's a different way of thinking how this should work. And so, and sometimes, some of those things, they're very clear, but then other times, you don't really know what they're thinking and how they processing things when you tell them, when you read scripture or have devotions, unless you ask super good questions to get to the bottom of it. How does that relate to your life? What are you thinking about this?
Mm,
How are you going to implement that? If you don't go like in those kind of practical routes, then you kind of never figure out really what's behind their thought process.
mm, mm. Yeah, that's what I was hinting at earlier. It's been such a process for me, and through the years of learning how to communicate and how to disciple, how to teach in that context, because it always takes, I don't even know. I was going to say 12 times longer than you would think. It could be way longer than that, right? Because of that thought process. So I would imagine it takes a lot of creativity and a lot of patience to help lead. And each child will be different. So it's not like there's a program that just
Mhm.
works for everyone, right? I mean, I know you guys spend a lot of individual time with the kids. So, I mean, I imagine it takes a lot of time and creativity and patience to
Yeah,
walk through
yeah,
this.
and that means we have to train our staff, because our staff are the ones actually that spend the most time on the day-to-day basis. And so, when we are talking about this, we are going back to, okay, how do you change this? Then I would say, we should invest in the staff first, because they got to get it first.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then, on the day to day things, then the staff can be there to help them maneuver through things.
Oh, yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, so in in trying to help, right? The those of us, and I'm sure people listening to this podcast, and many of us, we are like, well, I want to help, and I want to help do this. As we all know, there are great books on this, When Helping Hurts, and things like that. Are there ways that we as ministries and missionaries and churches trying to get involved, that are there ways that in our trying to help actually perpetuate the poverty mindset?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. But that's sometimes super hard to figure out. There's some guidelines you can follow, but it doesn't fit every situation. And, like it's a journey. So it's hard to know, where to draw a line.
Mm,
because you never know if the next help that you're going to give is going to make something click. And
wow.
yeah, that's the hard thing. Sometimes you do have to kind of back off and see what happens. And a lot of times, that is the right thing to do. And other times, it's not the right thing to do because you're trying to build trust,
Mm,
and consistency, and trying to figure out how to be there for a person even though you may have to not help them in some ways, but still to
mm,
be present is super important. They have to
yeah.
know I'm still there for you.
Yeah. Oh, wow. No, that's super helpful to understand and know, and really also why we as a ministry rely so heavily on you and our foreign national staff, right, to understand because of the relationships you have with the children, day to day, week to week, so that when we come in, even with teams, we're always trying to say, listen, yes, those you may have really good ideas, but we are going to go through everyone who works there always, who serves there continually because of their relational, connection to the kids, because of their understanding of where they are, and because, yeah, absolutely, what worked in another country or another area or another ministry with another kid may not work right here with this kid. And so, yeah, we lean heavily on you guys. Well, is there anything else you want to add to this discussion today before we wrap up?
No, I think this is good.
Well, I really appreciate it. I learn something every time we talk, TK. I appreciate you and your experience, your heart for the Lord, your heart for kids, your heart for discipleship. That we share that, and so it's always so good when we talk, and I learn so much, and I just really appreciate it. And thank you for what you do and for serving. And I appreciate that. Right after this, we're going to record one more today. It really stretched you today. I really appreciate that, TK.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Thanks for all you do also.
Oh, well,
Appreciate
of
it
uh,
much.
of course. Well, thank you guys so much for who have been listening and watching this. Listen, I'm going to ask you to do all the things because it helps us get our message out. It helps us plead the cause to more people. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you'll like this video, if you'll click the little bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post a new one. If you make a comment, that helps. All those things. If you're listening to this on a podcast platform, if you'll like, follow, subscribe, whatever that platform allows you to do, so that you can follow us and listen with consistency. Give us a rating on there. All those things help. And we're not making money off this podcast. We're just really trying to plead the cause and to plead it to as many people as we can, and get the body of Christ together, so that together we can serve the vulnerable and orphan children of the world. So thank you so much for joining us today as we plead the cause.